The year is 235 CE, and the Roman Empire stands at the precipice of its darkest hour. For nearly 3 centuries, Rome has dominated the Mediterranean world, its legions marching from Britain to Mesopotamia, its culture spreading across 3 continents. But now, in the cold Germanic forests near modern-day Mainz, an event is about to unfold that will plunge the empire into 50 years of chaos, civil war, and near collapse. This is the story of the crisis of the 3rd century, a period so tumultuous that it would see more than 20 emperors rise and fall, barbarian invasions penetrate the very heart of the empire, and the Roman world teeter on the brink of complete disintegration. Our tale begins with Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, known to history as Alexander Severus, the last emperor of the Severan dynasty. At just 13 years old, Alexander had been elevated to the purple in 222 CE, guided by his ambitious mother, Julia Mamaea, and his grandmother, Julia Maesa. For 13 years, he had ruled with a mixture of youthful idealism and maternal influence, attempting to restore the traditional values of the Roman Republic while managing an empire that had grown too vast and complex for any single ruler to control effectively. Alexander was, by many accounts, a conscientious ruler. He sought to reform the military, reduce corruption in the government, and maintain peaceful relations with Rome's neighbors whenever possible. His court was filled with learned men, philosophers, and administrators who genuinely believed they could restore the glory of the Antonine Age. The emperor himself was said to keep images of great men in his private chambers, including Alexander the Great, from whom he took his name, and even Jesus Christ, reflecting the religious syncretism that characterized the early 3rd century. But the empire Alexander inherited was already showing signs of severe strain. The military had become increasingly dominant in political affairs, with the Praetorian Guard and the legions wielding unprecedented influence over imperial succession. The economy was under pressure from constant warfare, debasement of the currency, and the enormous cost of maintaining the army. On the frontiers, new and more dangerous enemies were emerging, pressing against the Rhine and Danube with increasing frequency and ferocity. In 235 CE, Alexander found himself facing a crisis on the Germanic frontier. The Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes, had been conducting increasingly bold raids across the Rhine into Roman territory. These were not the scattered attacks of previous decades, but coordinated assaults that threatened the security of Gaul itself. The emperor, perhaps influenced by his mother's desire to avoid costly military campaigns, initially attempted to negotiate with the barbarians, offering them tribute and concessions in exchange for peace. This decision would prove to be Alexander's fatal mistake. The Roman army, particularly the soldiers stationed along the Rhine, viewed such negotiations as a sign of weakness unbecoming of a Roman emperor. The legions had been recruited largely from the frontier provinces, men who had grown up hearing stories of Roman military glory and who expected their emperor to lead them to victory against Rome's enemies, not to pay them off like some petty barbarian chieftain. The discontent among the troops was skillfully exploited by Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a career soldier who had risen through the ranks to become one of Alexander's most trusted generals. Maximinus was everything Alexander was not: a giant of a man, standing nearly 8 feet tall according to contemporary accounts, with the bearing and temperament of a professional warrior. Born in the remote province of Thrace to humble parents, he had spent his entire adult life in the army, serving with distinction in campaigns across the empire. The sources paint a vivid picture of Maximinus as a man of tremendous physical strength and military prowess. Herodian tells us that he could drink more wine than any 2 other men, that he could move wagons that teams of oxen could not budge, and that he could kill wild boars with his bare hands. Whether these stories are literally true or merely reflect the awe with which soldiers regarded their commander, they illustrate the kind of larger-than-life figure that Maximinus had become in the eyes of the army. More importantly, Maximinus understood the mood of his men. He shared their frustration with Alexander's specific policies, their desire for military glory, and their resentment at being asked to accept tribute payments to barbarians rather than victory over them. In hushed conversations around military camps, he began to voice what many soldiers were thinking: that Rome needed a soldier emperor, not a philosopher prince. The crisis came to a head in March 235 CE, when Alexander's negotiations with the Alemanni became widely known throughout the army. The emperor's decision to offer the barbarians gold and other concessions in exchange for peace was seen as a betrayal of everything Rome stood for. The legions, already restless and dissatisfied with their young emperor's leadership, found in Maximinus a focus for their discontent. The actual assassination of Alexander Severus was carried out with the swift brutality that would characterize the next 50 years of Roman history. According to Herodian's account, a group of soldiers, emboldened by Maximinus's implicit approval, entered the emperor's tent while he was resting. Alexander, perhaps sensing that something was amiss, attempted to flee, but he was quickly overtaken and struck down. His mother, Julia Mamaea, who had been the power behind the throne throughout his reign, was killed alongside him, bringing the Severan dynasty to a violent end. The soldiers immediately proclaimed Maximinus emperor, a decision that would be ratified by the Senate only after they had no choice but to accept the army's fait accompli. For the first time in Roman history, the empire was ruled by a man who had never held civilian office, who had never even set foot in Rome itself, and whose primary qualification for the position was his ability to command the loyalty of the legions. Maximinus's accession marked the beginning of what historians call the military anarchy, a period when the Roman Empire would be governed almost exclusively by soldier emperors who ruled through force and maintained power only as long as they could satisfy the army's demands for pay, plunder, and victory. The traditional cursus honorum, the careful progression through civil and military offices that had characterized Roman leadership for centuries, was swept away in favor of a more brutal meritocracy based solely on military success. The new emperor's first priority was to prove himself worthy of the soldiers' confidence by achieving the military victories that Alexander had failed to deliver. Maximinus immediately launched a campaign against the Alemanni, crossing the Rhine and driving deep into Germanic territory. The campaign was a success in purely military terms, with the Romans inflicting heavy casualties on the barbarians and capturing substantial amounts of loot. However, the victory came at a tremendous cost in both men and resources, and it did nothing to address the underlying problems that had led to the crisis in the first place. The economic implications of Maximinus's military policies were immediately apparent. The emperor's campaigns required enormous expenditures for equipment, supplies, and soldier bonuses, funds that had to be raised through increasingly oppressive taxation. The senatorial class, already alienated by the emperor's humble origins and military background, found themselves subjected to confiscations and forced contributions that made a mockery of their traditional privileges and immunities. The situation was made worse by Maximinus's apparent contempt for the civilian administration and the traditional Roman governmental institutions. Unlike previous emperors who had at least paid lip service to the Senate and the established procedures of government, Maximinus governed through military decree and showed little interest in the complex administrative machinery that kept the empire functioning. This approach may have been effective in the short term, but it created a dangerous precedent that would be followed by many of his successors. The emperor's policies also had serious consequences for the provinces. The increased taxation required to fund military campaigns fell most heavily on the urban middle classes and the rural landowners who formed the backbone of the imperial economy. Many cities found themselves unable to meet their tax obligations, leading to a cycle of confiscations and economic decline that would persist throughout the crisis period. The currency, already debased under previous emperors, was further devalued as the government struggled to meet its financial obligations. Perhaps most importantly, Maximinus's rise to power demonstrated that the emperor's authority ultimately rested on the support of the army rather than any constitutional or legal foundation. This lesson was not lost on ambitious military commanders throughout the empire, who began to calculate whether they, too, might be able to claim the purple if they could secure the loyalty of their troops. The precedent set by Maximinus would be followed again and again over the next 50 years, creating a cycle of civil war and military usurpation that would bring the empire to the brink of collapse. The barbarian situation, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate despite Maximinus's initial military successes. The Alemanni, though temporarily defeated, were not destroyed, and they continued to pose a threat to the Rhine frontier. More ominously, other Germanic tribes were beginning to press against the Roman borders with increasing frequency and coordination. The Goths, in particular, were emerging as a new and more dangerous enemy, launching their first major raids across the Danube during Maximinus's reign. The Gothic invasions represented a qualitatively different threat from the traditional barbarian raids that Rome had faced for centuries. Unlike the scattered tribal attacks of the past, the Gothic invasions were large-scale, coordinated assaults that combined land and sea operations and targeted the wealthiest and most important Roman cities. The Goths had learned from their interactions with Roman merchants and deserters, adopting Roman military techniques and equipment while maintaining their own tactical flexibility and mobility. The first Gothic raid, launched around 238 CE, caught the Roman authorities completely off guard. A fleet of Gothic ships sailed across the Black Sea and attacked the city of Histria, one of the most important commercial centers on the western shore of the Euxine. The city's defenses, designed to deal with traditional siege warfare, proved inadequate against the Goths' mobile tactics and superior numbers. The barbarians captured enormous amounts of loot and took thousands of prisoners before withdrawing to their homeland across the Danube. The psychological impact of this raid was perhaps even more significant than its material consequences. For the first time in centuries, barbarians had successfully attacked and looted a major Roman city, demonstrating that the empire's defenses were not impregnable. The news of Histria's fall spread quickly throughout the Roman world, causing panic in other frontier cities and undermining confidence in the government's ability to maintain security. The economic consequences of the barbarian invasions were equally severe. The disruption of trade routes, the loss of agricultural production in raided areas, and the enormous cost of defensive measures all contributed to the empire's growing financial crisis. The government's response, which typically involved raising taxes and confiscating property to fund military campaigns, only made the situation worse by further undermining the productive capacity of the provinces. The social effects of the crisis were perhaps most visible in the cities, which had been the backbone of Roman civilization for centuries. Urban life, which had flourished under the Pax Romana, began to decline as trade routes became unsafe and economic conditions deteriorated. Many cities found themselves unable to maintain their public buildings, aqueducts, and other infrastructure, leading to a gradual decay that would continue throughout the crisis period. The rural areas were equally affected, though in different ways. The constant warfare and heavy taxation made agricultural life increasingly difficult, leading to widespread abandonment of farms and the growth of brigandage. Many peasants fled to the cities or joined the army, seeking security and regular pay that they could no longer find in rural areas. This migration, in turn, reduced agricultural production and made the empire increasingly dependent on imported grain from Egypt and other provinces. The religious and cultural dimensions of the crisis were equally significant. The traditional Roman religion, already under pressure from Christianity and other mystery cults, seemed unable to provide comfort or explanation for the disasters that were befalling the empire. Many Romans began to question whether the gods had abandoned them, or whether the empire itself was being punished for some great collective sin. This religious uncertainty was reflected in the increasing popularity of apocalyptic literature and mystery religions that promise salvation in the afterlife rather than prosperity in this world. Christianity, in particular, began to attract converts not only from the lower classes but also from the educated urban elite who had traditionally been the strongest supporters of Roman culture and institutions. The intellectual climate of the early 3rd century was characterized by a growing sense of pessimism and decline. The great historian Dio Cassius, writing during this period, expressed the belief that the empire had entered an age of iron and rust, a time when the old virtues had been forgotten and the future looked increasingly dark. This sense of cultural crisis was reflected in literature, art, and philosophy, all of which began to emphasize themes of decay, transformation, and the search for meaning in an increasingly chaotic world. The military situation continued to deteriorate throughout 237 and 238 CE. Maximinus's campaigns, while initially successful, had failed to achieve any lasting strategic gains. The Germanic tribes, though temporarily defeated, remained a constant threat, and the emperor's harsh treatment of the provinces had created widespread resentment that would soon explode into open rebellion. The emperor's relationship with the Roman Senate had also reached a breaking point. The senators, traditional guardians of Roman law and custom, found themselves increasingly marginalized by a ruler who showed little respect for their authority or their persons. Many senators had been executed or forced into exile on charges of treason, while others had seen their property confiscated to fund military campaigns. The Senate as an institution was rapidly losing its traditional role in Roman government, replaced by a military autocracy that ruled through force rather than consent. The economic crisis, meanwhile, had reached critical proportions. The constant warfare and heavy taxation had undermined the productive capacity of the provinces, while the debasement of the currency had led to widespread inflation and economic uncertainty. Trade, which had been the lifeblood of the Roman economy, was disrupted by barbarian raids and civil unrest. Many regions that had been prosperous under previous emperors were now experiencing economic decline and social dislocation. The human cost of the crisis was enormous. Contemporary sources speak of cities being abandoned, farms lying fallow, and entire regions being depopulated by war, disease, and economic collapse. The carefully constructed social and economic system that had supported Roman civilization for centuries was beginning to break down, replaced by a more primitive economy based on military force and local self-sufficiency. It was against this background of growing crisis that the events of 238 CE would unfold, a year that would see 6 different men claim the title of emperor and would demonstrate just how far the Roman Empire had fallen from its former glory. The death of Alexander Severus had opened a Pandora's box of civil war and military anarchy that would take decades to close, and the rise of Maximinus had shown that the empire's traditional institutions were no longer capable of maintaining order and stability. The stage was now set for the most chaotic period in Roman history, a time when the empire would fragment into competing power centers, when barbarian invasions would penetrate to the very heart of the Mediterranean world, and when the ancient civilization that had dominated the West for centuries would come closer to complete collapse than ever before or since. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun, and its effects would reshape the Roman world forever. As we prepare to delve deeper into this tumultuous period, we must remember that the men and women who lived through these events could not have known that their world would survive. To them, it must have seemed as though the end of civilization itself was at hand. The great cities were under attack, the government was in chaos, and the very foundations of their society were crumbling. Yet somehow, through all the darkness and destruction, the essential core of Roman civilization would endure, transformed and strengthened by the trials it was about to face. The year 238 CE would enter history as the year of the 6 emperors, a period of such extraordinary chaos and bloodshed that it would forever change the nature of imperial power in Rome. As Maximinus Thrax continued his brutal campaigns beyond the Rhine, the seeds of rebellion were already being sown in the wealthy province of Africa, where the emperor's oppressive fiscal policies had pushed the population beyond the breaking point. The spark that ignited the conflagration came from an unexpected source: a dispute over taxation in the city of Thysdrus, modern-day El Jem in Tunisia. The procurator of Africa, a man named Capelianus, had been enforcing Maximinus's harsh tax collection policies with particular brutality, seizing property from wealthy landowners and merchants to fund the emperor's endless military campaigns. The situation came to a head when a group of young men, members of prominent local families, found themselves facing financial ruin due to the government's demands. In a moment of desperation and anger, these young men killed the procurator and several of his officials, an act that would normally have been met with swift and terrible retribution. However, the political climate in 238 was such that this local revolt quickly took on imperial dimensions. The conspirators, realizing that they had committed an act of treason that would be punished by death, decided that their only hope of survival lay in revolution. The leader of this unlikely rebellion was Marcus Antonius Gordianus, an elderly senator who had been serving as governor of Africa. Gordianus was nearly 80 years old, a man of distinguished family and considerable wealth who had enjoyed a successful career under previous emperors. He was everything that Maximinus was not: cultured, educated, and deeply rooted in the traditional Roman senatorial class. His very presence in Africa was a symbol of the old order that Maximinus had so thoroughly rejected. The conspirators approached Gordianus with a proposal that must have seemed both flattering and terrifying. They wanted him to assume the purple and lead a revolt against Maximinus. Initially, the old senator was reluctant to involve himself in such a dangerous enterprise. He was well aware of the fate that awaited unsuccessful pretenders to the throne, and at his age, he had little to gain from political adventure. However, the young men made it clear that they would not accept refusal, and Gordianus found himself forced to choose between certain death at the hands of Maximinus's agents and uncertain death as a rebel emperor. On March 22, 238 CE, Marcus Antonius Gordianus was proclaimed emperor by the people of Thysdrus, taking the name Gordianus I. His son, Marcus Antonius Gordianus, was elevated to the position of Caesar and co-emperor, becoming Gordianus II. The choice of both father and son was significant, as it provided the rebellion with both the gravitas of age and the energy of youth, while also ensuring continuity of leadership should one of the emperors meet an untimely end. The new emperors faced enormous challenges from the moment of their accession. Africa, while wealthy and strategically important, was far removed from the centers of imperial power. The province had no significant military forces, and the new rulers would need to secure the loyalty of the legions if they hoped to survive. Moreover, they were acutely aware that Maximinus would not allow such a challenge to his authority to go unpunished. Gordianus I and II moved quickly to consolidate their position. They sent embassies to Rome, seeking recognition from the Senate and the support of the urban population. The message they carried was carefully crafted to appeal to all those who had suffered under Maximinus's rule. The senators who had been humiliated and impoverished, the merchants who had seen their businesses destroyed by taxation, and the common people who had borne the burden of the emperor's military adventures. The Senate's response exceeded the Gordians' wildest expectations. The senators, who had been looking for an opportunity to rid themselves of the hated soldier emperor, immediately declared their support for the African rebels. In a passionate session, they proclaimed Gordianus I and II as legitimate emperors and declared Maximinus a public enemy. They also took the unprecedented step of authorizing the creation of a senatorial army, recruiting volunteers from among the urban population and placing them under the command of two senators, Pupienus and Balbinus. The speed with which the Senate moved to support the Gordians reflected the depth of their hatred for Maximinus. The traditional Roman aristocracy had been systematically humiliated and impoverished by the Thracian emperor, who had shown nothing but contempt for their ancient privileges and customs. The opportunity to strike back at their tormentor was too tempting to resist, even though it meant plunging the empire into civil war. The popular response in Rome was equally enthusiastic. The urban mob, which had suffered under Maximinus's heavy taxation and military conscription, rose in support of the Gordians. Riots broke out in several districts of the city, with crowds attacking the symbols of Maximinus's rule and demanding the return of the old order. The Praetorian Guard, which had been the backbone of Maximinus's power, found itself isolated and outnumbered, unable to maintain order in the capital. Meanwhile, in Africa, the Gordians were discovering the harsh realities of imperial power. Their initial euphoria was quickly tempered by the news that Capelianus, the procurator whose murder had triggered the revolt, had escaped to Numidia, where he was rallying loyal forces. Moreover, reports were arriving that Maximinus had abandoned his Germanic campaigns and was marching south toward Italy with his entire army. The situation in Africa deteriorated rapidly. Capelianus, who had served as a military commander before becoming a fiscal administrator, proved to be a formidable opponent. He had managed to gather a force of regular troops and local auxiliaries, including contingents of Numidian cavalry that gave him a significant tactical advantage. The Gordians, lacking experienced military commanders and having only a hastily assembled militia at their disposal, found themselves facing a professional army led by a skilled general. The decisive battle took place near Carthage in early April 238 CE. The engagement was brief but devastating for the Gordians. Capelianus's forces, despite being outnumbered, used their superior training and equipment to devastating effect. The Gordians' militia, composed largely of urban civilians and rural volunteers, broke and fled after the first charge. Gordianus II, who had been leading the army despite his lack of military experience, was killed in the fighting, dying with the courage of a Roman nobleman even if he lacked the skills of a professional soldier. The news of his son's death was brought to Gordianus I as he waited in Carthage. The old emperor, who had never wanted the purple and had accepted it only under duress, was devastated by the loss of his son and heir. Contemporary sources tell us that he spent several hours in his private chambers, contemplating the ruins of his family's hopes and the certain fate that awaited him. Rather than face capture and the inevitable torture that would follow, Gordianus I chose to end his own life, hanging himself with his belt. The African revolt, which had begun with such promise just 3 weeks earlier, had ended in complete disaster. The failure of the Gordians rebellion might have ended the crisis, but the political situation in Rome had developed its own momentum. The Senate, having committed itself to opposition to Maximinus, could not simply abandon their cause without facing certain destruction. The senators knew that the Thracian emperor would never forgive their betrayal, and their only hope of survival lay in finding new champions to lead the resistance. The choice fell on Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus and Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus, 2 senators who had been instrumental in organizing the opposition to Maximinus. Both men were experienced administrators and military commanders, though neither had the charisma or popular appeal that might have made them effective leaders in such turbulent times. Pupienus, the senior of the two, was a man of humble origins who had risen through the ranks of the imperial administration through competence and hard work. Balbinus, by contrast, was a member of an ancient patrician family who embodied the traditional values of the Roman aristocracy. The Senate's decision to elevate 2 emperors simultaneously was unprecedented and reflected the desperate nature of their situation. The arrangement was meant to combine the practical experience of Pupienus with the aristocratic legitimacy of Balbinus, while also ensuring that neither man could accumulate too much power. However, the dual emperorship created as many problems as it solved, as the 2 men had very different personalities and approaches to governance. The joint emperors faced immediate challenges on multiple fronts. Maximinus was approaching Italy with his army, and the senatorial forces were utterly inadequate to face veteran legions in open battle. The urban population, while initially supportive of the Senate's actions, was becoming increasingly restless as food shortages and economic disruption took their toll. Most seriously, the Praetorian Guard, which had been marginalized by the Senate's actions, was actively hostile to the new regime. Pupienus and Balbinus attempted to address these challenges through a division of responsibilities. Pupienus, who had more military experience, would take command of the forces being assembled to face Maximinus, while Balbinus would remain in Rome to maintain order and manage the administration. This arrangement, while logical, had the unfortunate effect of separating the 2 emperors at a time when unity was essential. The military situation was particularly challenging. The senatorial army, composed largely of volunteers and hastily recruited levies, was no match for Maximinus's professional soldiers. The senators had attempted to compensate for their lack of military strength by fortifying northern Italy and adopting a defensive strategy, hoping to wear down the invading army through attrition. However, this approach required time and resources that the government simply did not possess. The economic crisis, meanwhile, continued to deepen. The cost of maintaining 2 imperial courts, combined with the expense of raising and equipping military forces, had placed an enormous strain on the treasury. The government was forced to resort to increasingly desperate measures to raise funds, including the confiscation of temple treasures and the forced contributions from wealthy citizens. These policies, while necessary for survival, further undermined popular support for the regime. The situation in Rome itself was becoming increasingly volatile. The urban population, while initially enthusiastic about the Senate's actions, was beginning to feel the effects of the crisis. Food shortages, caused by the disruption of trade routes and the government's inability to maintain the grain supply, led to riots and civil unrest. The Praetorian Guard, which had been the traditional guarantor of order in the capital, was now viewed with suspicion by the Senate and was unwilling to act decisively to restore peace. As spring turned to summer, Maximinus's army continued its inexorable advance toward Rome. The Thracian emperor had been delayed by the need to besiege several fortified cities in northern Italy, but his forces were steadily grinding down the senatorial defenses. The most significant obstacle was the city of Aquileia, which had declared for the Senate and was now under siege by Maximinus's forces. The siege of Aquileia would prove to be the turning point of the crisis. The city, one of the most important commercial centers in northern Italy, was strongly fortified and well-supplied. Its population, aware of the fate that awaited them if they surrendered, fought with desperate courage. The defenders, led by local magistrates and supported by a small force of regular troops, managed to hold out for several weeks despite being vastly outnumbered. More importantly, the siege gave the opposition time to organize and allowed cracks to appear in Maximinus's support. The emperor's army, composed largely of troops from the northern frontiers, was not accustomed to siege warfare and was becoming increasingly demoralized by the prolonged resistance. The soldiers, who had expected a quick victory and the opportunity to plunder Rome, found themselves bogged down in a lengthy and costly siege with no immediate prospect of success. The psychological impact of Aquileia's resistance was enormous. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, it appeared that Maximinus might not be invincible. The news of the siege spread throughout the empire, encouraging other cities to resist and giving hope to those who opposed the emperor. The very fact that a single city could hold out against the supposedly invincible imperial army demonstrated that the emperor's power was not absolute. The situation for Maximinus's forces was made worse by supply problems. The army, which had been living off the land during its march through Italy, found itself unable to forage effectively while conducting a siege. The local population, hostile to the invaders and loyal to the Senate, provided no assistance, while the defenders of Aquileia had destroyed much of the surrounding countryside to deny resources to the besiegers. As the siege dragged on, discipline in Maximinus's army began to break down. The soldiers, who had been promised easy victory and rich plunder, were instead facing hunger, disease, and the daily casualties of siege warfare. Desertion became increasingly common, and there were reports of mutinous talk in the ranks. The emperor's harsh discipline, which had been effective in maintaining order during successful campaigns, now seemed merely cruel and arbitrary. The crisis came to a head in late May 238 CE. A group of officers from the Second Parthian Legion, frustrated by the prolonged siege and concerned about their own survival, decided to take action. In a carefully planned conspiracy, they entered the emperor's tent during the afternoon rest period and murdered both Maximinus and his son, Maximus Caesar. The deed was done quickly and efficiently, with no opportunity for the emperor to defend himself or call for help. The assassination of Maximinus was met with relief rather than shock by his army. The soldiers, who had been suffering under the hardships of the siege, saw the emperor's death as an opportunity to end the campaign and return to their homes. The conspirators immediately declared their loyalty to the Senate and the emperors in Rome, and this declaration was quickly echoed by the rest of the army. The news of Maximinus's death was received with jubilation in Rome. The Senate, which had been preparing for what seemed like inevitable defeat, suddenly found itself victorious. Pupienus and Balbinus, who had been struggling to maintain their position, were now hailed as the saviors of the empire. The urban population, which had been growing increasingly restless, celebrated in the streets, and it seemed as though the crisis might finally be over. However, the victory over Maximinus had solved only one of the government's problems. The fundamental issues that had caused the crisis remained unaddressed, and new challenges were already emerging. The army of Maximinus, while no longer hostile, remained a potent force that needed to be managed carefully. The economic crisis continued to deepen, and the provinces remained in chaos. Most ominously, the Praetorian Guard, which had been marginalized throughout the crisis, was becoming increasingly restless. The Praetorians had several grievances against the senatorial government. They had been excluded from the decision-making process and had seen their traditional role as kingmakers usurped by the Senate. They were also concerned about their own survival, as it was unclear whether the new regime would maintain the Guard or replace it with more loyal forces. Finally, they were influenced by the urban mob, which was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the joint emperor's rule. The situation was complicated by the presence in Rome of Marcus Antonius Gordianus, the grandson of Gordianus I and nephew of Gordianus II. The young man, who was only about 13 years old, had been brought to Rome by his supporters and was being presented as the legitimate heir to the African emperors. His presence created a rival focus of loyalty that threatened to undermine the authority of Pupienus and Balbinus. The crisis came to a head in late July 238 CE. The Praetorian Guard, encouraged by elements of the urban population and possibly by supporters of the young Gordianus, decided to take action. In a carefully planned operation, they seized both emperors while they were in the palace, claiming that they intended to force them to share power with Gordianus. However, the situation quickly got out of hand. The details of what happened next are disputed by the sources, but the outcome was clear. Both Pupienus and Balbinus were killed, either by the Praetorians themselves or by the mob that had gathered outside the palace. The joint emperorship, which had lasted only about 3 months, came to a violent end. The Senate, which had hoped to reassert its authority over the empire, found itself once again subordinated to the will of the military. The Praetorians immediately proclaimed the young Gordianus as emperor, giving him the name Gordianus III. The choice was partly pragmatic, as the boy represented continuity with the popular African emperors, and partly strategic, as his youth made him an ideal puppet ruler. The Senate, faced with a fait accompli and having no alternative, reluctantly ratified the Guard's decision. The accession of Gordianus III marked the end of the immediate crisis, but it also demonstrated the fundamental instability of the imperial system. In the space of a single year, the empire had seen 6 different emperors, each representing different power centers and constituencies. The traditional sources of authority, the Senate, the army, the Praetorian Guard, and popular opinion, had all asserted their claims, but none had proved capable of establishing lasting stability. The young emperor faced enormous challenges from the moment of his accession. At 13 years old, he was completely inexperienced in governance and would need to rely heavily on advisors and regents. The empire was in chaos, with multiple provinces in rebellion and barbarian invasions threatening the frontiers. The economy was in ruins, and the military was demoralized and divided. Most importantly, the precedent had been set that emperors could be made and unmade at will, a lesson that would be learned by ambitious commanders throughout the empire. The Gothic threat, which had been temporarily overshadowed by the civil wars, now emerged as the most serious challenge facing the new government. The Goths, taking advantage of the empire's internal divisions, had launched a series of devastating raids across the Danube frontier. Unlike the scattered tribal attacks of previous decades, these invasions were large-scale, coordinated operations that threatened the security of the entire Balkan region. The Gothic confederations that emerged in the 3rd century represented a new type of barbarian threat. These were not simple tribal raiders but complex political entities that combined traditional Germanic warrior culture with sophisticated knowledge of Roman military techniques and political organization. The Goths had learned much from their interactions with Roman merchants, deserters, and prisoners, and they were now applying this knowledge to devastating effect. The first major Gothic invasion of Gordianus III's reign began in 238 CE, just as the young emperor was consolidating his power in Rome. A large Gothic force, estimated at over 100,000 warriors, crossed the Danube and struck deep into the Roman province of Moesia. The provincial garrison, weakened by the civil wars and lacking competent leadership, was unable to mount effective resistance. The Goth strategy was both simple and effective. Rather than attempting to hold territory, they focused on rapid raids designed to capture maximum plunder and prisoners while avoiding pitched battles with Roman forces. Their mobility, combined with their knowledge of Roman defensive preparations, allowed them to strike at the most vulnerable targets while avoiding the empire's remaining strongholds. The economic impact of these raids was devastating. The Goths targeted the wealthiest cities and the most productive agricultural regions, carrying off enormous quantities of gold, silver, and manufactured goods. Even more damaging was their practice of capturing skilled craftsmen and educated prisoners, who were then transported back to Gothic territory where they could contribute to the barbarians' own development. The psychological impact of the Gothic success was equally significant. For centuries, Romans had viewed barbarians as primitive savages who could be defeated by superior Roman organization and discipline. The Gothic victories demonstrated that this assumption was no longer valid, and that the empire was vulnerable to enemies who combined barbarian mobility with Roman military knowledge. The response of the Roman government to the Gothic threat was hampered by the ongoing political crisis. Gordianus III, despite his youth, was eager to prove himself as a military leader and win the glory that had eluded his predecessors. However, his advisors, led by the Praetorian prefect Timesitheus, were more cautious and preferred to focus on stabilizing the internal situation before launching major military campaigns. The debate over strategy reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of the crisis and the appropriate response. Some advisors argued that the empire's problems were primarily military and could be solved through aggressive campaigns against the barbarians. Others contended that the real issues were political and economic, and that military adventures would only make the situation worse. This disagreement would persist throughout Gordianus III's reign and would influence imperial policy for decades to come. As 238 CE drew to a close, the Roman Empire found itself in a fundamentally different situation than it had been at the beginning of the year. The traditional political order had been shattered, and new power relationships were emerging. The army had demonstrated its ability to make and unmake emperors, while the Senate had shown both its potential strength and its ultimate weakness. The barbarian threat had evolved from a border problem into an existential challenge, and the economy was showing signs of the strain that would characterize the entire crisis period. The year of the six emperors had ended, but its legacy would shape the empire for the next half-century. The precedents set in 238 CE would be followed again and again, as ambitious commanders sought to claim the purple and desperate populations looked for salvation from whoever seemed most likely to provide it. The crisis of the 3rd century had truly begun, and the worst was yet to come. The ascension of Gordianus III marked the beginning of what would prove to be one of the most significant reigns of the crisis period, not for its length, but for the administrative reforms and military innovations that would influence imperial policy for decades to come. The young emperor, barely 14 years old when he assumed the purple, was fortunate to have as his chief advisor and eventual father-in-law one of the most capable administrators of the 3rd century, Gaius Furius Sabinius Aquila Timesitheus. Timesitheus was a man of extraordinary ability who had risen through the ranks of the imperial bureaucracy through merit rather than birth. Born into an equestrian family, he had distinguished himself in a series of administrative posts throughout the empire, earning a reputation for efficiency, honesty, and practical wisdom. His appointment as Praetorian prefect under Gordianus III represented not just a personal triumph but a victory for the professional administrative class that had been marginalized during the chaotic years of military rule. The relationship between the young emperor and his seasoned advisor was complex and multifaceted. Timesitheus served not only as Praetorian prefect but also as the emperor's mentor, father-in-law, and de facto regent. Contemporary sources suggest that he approached his role with a mixture of paternal affection and bureaucratic professionalism, genuinely caring for the young man's development while also ensuring that the empire's affairs were conducted with the competence that had been so lacking in recent years. Under Timesitheus's guidance, the imperial administration underwent a significant transformation. The chaotic military autocracy that had characterized the reigns of Maximinus and his immediate successors was replaced by a more traditional system that emphasized administrative efficiency and legal procedures. The Praetorian prefect worked systematically to restore the functioning of the imperial bureaucracy, recalling experienced administrators who had been dismissed or marginalized during the previous upheavals. One of Timesitheus's most important reforms concerned the military supply system. The constant campaigns of the previous decades had placed enormous strain on the empire's logistical capabilities, and the breakdown of supply lines had contributed to the military unrest that had plagued recent reigns. The Praetorian prefect implemented a comprehensive reorganization of military provisioning, establishing new supply depots, improving transportation networks, and creating more efficient systems for distributing equipment and rations to the troops. The economic policies pursued under Timesitheus's influence represented a marked departure from the crude expedients that had characterized previous administrations. Rather than simply confiscating wealth to fund immediate military needs, the government began to implement longer-term fiscal reforms designed to restore the empire's productive capacity. Tax collection was regularized and made more predictable, reducing the arbitrary confiscations that had devastated the provincial economy. At the same time, efforts were made to restore trade routes and encourage commercial activity. The currency reforms implemented during this period were particularly significant. The debasement of silver coins, which had accelerated dramatically under Maximinus, was slowed and partially reversed. New minting standards were established, and efforts were made to restore confidence in the imperial currency. While these measures could not completely solve the empire's monetary problems, they did provide a temporary stabilization that allowed economic recovery to begin. The administrative renaissance under Timesitheus also extended to the legal system. The arbitrary executions and confiscations that had characterized the military emperors were replaced by more regular judicial procedures. The Praetorian prefect worked to restore the authority of civilian courts and to ensure that legal proceedings followed established procedures. This restoration of legal order was crucial for maintaining the confidence of the provincial elites, whose cooperation was essential for effective imperial administration. The relationship between the imperial government and the Senate also improved significantly during this period. While the Senate had been thoroughly humiliated by the events of 238 CE, Timesitheus understood that the cooperation of the senatorial class was essential for effective governance. He worked to restore the Senate's dignity and to involve senators in the administration of the empire, though always within the framework of imperial supremacy. The young emperor himself, under Timesitheus's tutelage, showed considerable promise as a ruler. Despite his youth, Gordianus III demonstrated a genuine interest in the welfare of his subjects and a willingness to learn from his experienced advisors. He was particularly interested in military affairs and showed considerable aptitude for the strategic thinking that would be essential for dealing with the empire's numerous external threats. The Gothic situation, which had been temporarily stabilized by the confusion following the year of the six emperors, began to deteriorate again in 241 CE. The barbarian confederations beyond the Danube had used the period of Roman civil war to consolidate their own power and prepare for renewed invasions. The Goths, in particular, had formed new alliances with other Germanic tribes and had begun to develop more sophisticated military techniques. The renewed Gothic threat manifested itself in a series of coordinated attacks along the entire length of the Danube frontier. Unlike the sporadic raids of previous years, these invasions were carefully planned operations that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Roman defensive capabilities and weaknesses. The Goths had learned to coordinate land and sea operations, using their control of the Black Sea to launch amphibious attacks on Roman coastal cities while simultaneously mounting overland assaults on frontier fortifications. The Roman response to these renewed barbarian invasions was hampered by the need to address an even more serious threat on the eastern frontier. The Sassanid Persian Empire, under the leadership of the ambitious young king Shapur I, had launched a major offensive against Roman territories in Mesopotamia and Syria. The Persian invasion represented a qualitatively different challenge from the Gothic raids, as it involved a sophisticated enemy with resources and organizational capabilities comparable to those of Rome itself. Shapur I was a ruler of exceptional ability who had spent his early years consolidating Sassanid control over the Iranian plateau and preparing for a showdown with Rome. The Persian king understood that the Roman Empire's internal difficulties provided an unprecedented opportunity for territorial expansion, and he was determined to exploit Roman weakness to the fullest extent possible. His invasion of Roman Mesopotamia in 242 CE was conducted with a level of strategic sophistication that caught the imperial government completely off guard. The Persian offensive began with a coordinated assault on the key fortress city of Nisibis, which controlled the main route between Roman Syria and Mesopotamia. The siege of Nisibis demonstrated the advanced military capabilities that the Sassanids had developed, including sophisticated siege engines and systematic approaches to reducing fortified positions. The city's eventual fall after a prolonged resistance sent shockwaves throughout the eastern provinces and demonstrated that the Persian threat was far more serious than previously imagined. The news of Nisibis' fall reached Rome at a time when the government was already struggling to deal with the Gothic invasions and the ongoing economic crisis. The prospect of a major war on two fronts presented challenges that would have taxed the resources of the empire even under the best of circumstances. For a government that was still recovering from the chaos of the previous decade, the situation seemed almost hopeless. It was in this context that Timesitheus demonstrated the strategic vision that made him one of the most capable administrators of the 3rd century. Rather than attempting to fight both the Goths and the Persians simultaneously, he developed a comprehensive strategy that prioritized the eastern theater while maintaining a defensive posture on the Danube. His reasoning was based on a careful analysis of the relative threats posed by each enemy and the empire's available resources. The Persian invasion, while more limited in scope than the Gothic raids, threatened territories that were far more valuable to the empire. The loss of Mesopotamia would deprive Rome of crucial agricultural and commercial resources, while the fall of Syria would threaten the empire's control over the vital trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the East. Moreover, the Persians posed a direct threat to one of the empire's most important cities, Antioch, whose fall would have catastrophic consequences for imperial prestige and security. The preparation for the Persian War required a massive mobilization of resources that demonstrated both the empire's remaining strength and the severe strain that the crisis had placed on imperial capabilities. Troops were withdrawn from the Rhine and Danube frontiers, leaving those regions vulnerable to barbarian attack. The treasury was emptied to fund the campaign, requiring new taxes and the renewed debasement of the currency. Most significantly, the young emperor himself would need to take personal command of the expedition, despite his lack of military experience. The Eastern Campaign of 243 to 244 CE represented one of the most ambitious military undertakings of the crisis period. The army that assembled for the Persian War was one of the largest Roman forces fielded in decades, drawing troops from across the empire and representing a wide variety of military traditions and capabilities. The logistics of moving and supplying such a large force across the challenging terrain of the Near East required organizational skills of the highest order. Timesitheus's role in organizing the Persian campaign demonstrated his exceptional administrative capabilities. He personally oversaw the establishment of supply lines, the coordination of troop movements, and the diplomatic preparations necessary for such a major undertaking. His attention to detail and systematic approach to problem-solving ensured that the Roman army would be as well prepared as possible for the challenges ahead. The initial phases of the campaign were remarkably successful. The Roman army, reinvigorated by competent leadership and adequate supplies, moved rapidly through Syria and into Mesopotamia. The Persian forces, which had been scattered in garrison duties throughout the occupied territories, were unable to concentrate quickly enough to meet the Roman advance. Several important cities were recaptured, and it began to seem as though the empire might achieve a decisive victory over its eastern rival. The turning point of the campaign came with the death of Timesitheus in early 244 CE. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, with some sources suggesting natural causes while others hint at poison. What is certain is that his loss was a catastrophic blow to both the young emperor and the empire as a whole. Timesitheus had been the brain behind the Roman recovery, and his death left a void that could not easily be filled. The immediate consequence of Timesitheus's death was a struggle for influence over the young emperor. Several candidates emerged to fill the role of chief advisor, but the most successful was Marcus Julius Philippus, a man who would become known to history as Philip the Arab. Philip was a native of the Roman province of Arabia, who had risen through the ranks of the imperial administration to become praetorian prefect following Timesitheus's death. Philip was a man of considerable ability and ambition, but he lacked the disinterested loyalty that had characterized his predecessor. While Timesitheus had genuinely served the empire's interests, Philip was primarily concerned with advancing his own position and that of his family. His appointment as praetorian prefect marked the beginning of the end for Gordianus III's reign, though this was not immediately apparent to contemporaries. The Persian campaign, deprived of Timesitheus's strategic vision and logistical expertise, began to encounter serious difficulties. Supply lines became stretched and vulnerable, and the Persian forces, now reinforced by troops recalled from other theaters, began to mount more effective resistance. The Roman army, which had seemed invincible during the early stages of the campaign, found itself bogged down in a war of attrition that favored the defenders. The climax of the campaign came at the Battle of Messèche in 244 CE, where the Roman army suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Shapur I's forces. The battle was a tactical disaster for the Romans, who were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by superior Persian strategy and battlefield coordination. The defeat not only ended Roman hopes of a decisive victory, but also placed the entire army in mortal danger. In the aftermath of the defeat, the young emperor found himself in an impossible position. The army was demoralized and surrounded by enemies, supplies were running low, and there seemed to be no prospect of relief. It was in this desperate situation that the final act of Gordianus III's reign was played out. According to the official version of events, The young emperor died of wounds received in the battle, but many contemporary sources suggest that he was actually murdered by his own troops at the instigation of Philip the Arab. The death of Gordianus III marked the end of the last attempt to restore traditional forms of imperial government during the crisis period. The young emperor's reign had shown that competent administration could still achieve remarkable results, but it had also demonstrated the fragility of such achievements in the face of the empire's fundamental problems. The reforms of Timesitheus had provided temporary stability, but they had not addressed the underlying issues that made the empire vulnerable to both internal subversion and external attack. Philip the Arab's assumption of power marked a return to the pattern of military usurpation that had characterized the earlier phases of the crisis. The new emperor's first priority was to extricate the Roman army from its dangerous situation in Mesopotamia, and he was willing to pay almost any price to achieve this goal. The peace treaty negotiated with Shapur I was highly favorable to the Persians, involving substantial territorial concessions and the payment of a large indemnity. The terms of the Persian peace treaty reflected the empire's desperate military situation and Philip's determination to secure his own position at any cost. The Romans agreed to abandon their conquests in Mesopotamia and to recognize Persian sovereignty over disputed territories. More humiliatingly, they agreed to pay an enormous indemnity to Shapur I, effectively buying their way out of the war. The treaty was a strategic disaster for Rome, but it did achieve its immediate objective of allowing the army to return safely to Roman territory. Philip's return to Rome was marked by elaborate celebrations designed to obscure the reality of the Eastern defeat. The new emperor, drawing on his experience in provincial administration, understood the importance of public relations and worked systematically to present himself as a victorious general rather than a defeated commander. These efforts were partially successful, at least in the short term, as the Roman public was eager for good news after years of crisis and defeat. The centerpiece of Philip's propaganda campaign was the celebration of Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248 CE. The secular games held to commemorate this milestone were among the most elaborate festivities in the city's history, featuring spectacular gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances, and public feasts. The celebrations were designed to create a sense of continuity with Rome's glorious past, and to suggest that the empire's troubles were temporary setbacks rather than fundamental problems. The millennial celebrations were a remarkable spectacle that temporarily restored a sense of unity and purpose to the Roman world. Citizens from across the empire flocked to Rome to participate in the festivities, and the city experienced a brief revival of the prosperity and confidence that had characterized the Antonine period. The games themselves were conducted with a magnificence that recalled the greatest celebrations of the past, featuring exotic animals, elaborate theatrical productions, and athletic competitions that drew the finest performers from throughout the Mediterranean world. However, the celebrations could not disguise the empire's fundamental problems, and the cost of the festivities only added to the government's financial difficulties. The resources devoted to the Millennial Games might have been better spent on addressing the empire's military and economic challenges, but Philip understood that public spectacle was essential for maintaining his political position. The emperor's background as a provincial administrator had taught him the importance of managing public opinion, and he was willing to spend heavily to maintain his popularity. The apparent success of the millennial celebrations masked growing problems within the empire. The Gothic invasions had resumed with renewed intensity, taking advantage of the troops withdrawn for the Persian campaign. The economic situation remained precarious, with inflation and currency debasement continuing to undermine the empire's financial stability. Most ominously, the army remained restless and dissatisfied, with many soldiers questioning Philip's legitimacy and his competence as a military leader. The crisis came to a head in 249 CE with the outbreak of a major Gothic invasion that penetrated deep into the Balkans. The barbarian force, estimated at over 70,000 warriors, crossed the Danube and began systematically ravaging the Roman provinces of Moesia and Thrace. The invasion was more serious than any previous Gothic attack, involving not just raiding parties but entire tribal populations seeking new lands for settlement. Philip's response to the Gothic invasion was hampered by his lack of military experience and his uncertain relationship with the army. The emperor was a capable administrator but had never commanded troops in battle, and his authority was questioned by many of the professional soldiers who formed the backbone of the Roman military. The situation was made worse by the fact that many of the empire's best troops were still recovering from the Persian campaign and were not immediately available for deployment against the Goths. The command of the anti-Gothic campaign was given to Gaius Messius Quintus Decius, a senator of distinguished family who had served with distinction in various military and administrative posts. Decius was an experienced commander who had earned the respect of his soldiers, but he was also a man of traditional Roman values who was deeply troubled by the empire's apparent decline. His appointment represented Philip's attempt to combine military competence with political reliability, but it would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. The campaign against the Goths began promisingly, with Decius demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking and tactical competence that had been lacking in recent military operations. The Roman forces, reinvigorated by effective leadership, began to push back the Gothic invaders and to restore some measure of security to the threatened provinces. However, the very success of the campaign created new problems for Philip, as Decius's victories made him a popular figure with the army and a potential rival for imperial power. The transformation of Decius from loyal general to imperial claimant followed the pattern that had become depressingly familiar during the crisis period. The troops under his command, impressed by his military skill and traditional Roman virtues, began to suggest that he would make a better emperor than Philip. Initially, Decius resisted these suggestions, but the pressure from his soldiers became increasingly difficult to ignore. The precedent set by previous military usurpations made it clear that successful generals were expected to claim the purple, and failure to do so might be interpreted as a sign of weakness. The decisive moment came when Decius's troops proclaimed him emperor in defiance of his own wishes. According to contemporary accounts, the general was reluctant to accept the honor, but his soldiers made it clear that they would not accept refusal. The proclamation was made in the field, following the established pattern of military usurpation, and it immediately created a new civil war that the empire could ill afford. Philip's response to Decius's proclamation was swift but ultimately ineffective. The emperor gathered what forces he could and marched north to confront the usurper, but his army was smaller and less experienced than Decius's veteran troops. The decisive battle was fought at Verona in 249 CE, where Philip's forces were comprehensively defeated. The emperor himself was killed in the fighting, along with most of his supporters, bringing his brief reign to a violent end. The victory at Verona established Decius as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, but it also inherited him a daunting array of problems. The Gothic invasion was still in progress, requiring immediate military attention. The economy remained in crisis, with no obvious solutions to the problems of inflation and currency debasement. Perhaps most seriously, the precedent of military usurpation had been reinforced once again, making it likely that other ambitious commanders would follow Decius's example. Decius's approach to these challenges reflected his background as a traditional Roman senator and his deep commitment to the values of the Republican past. Unlike many of his predecessors, who had been primarily concerned with immediate survival, Decius attempted to implement comprehensive reforms that would address the empire's fundamental problems. His program included military reorganization, religious revival, and administrative reform, all designed to restore the empire to its former greatness. The military reforms implemented by Decius were particularly significant. The emperor recognized that the Roman army had become too dependent on barbarian auxiliaries and foreign mercenaries, and he attempted to restore the citizen-soldier tradition that had made Rome great. New recruitment policies were implemented to encourage Roman citizens to serve in the legions, while efforts were made to improve military training and discipline. The reforms were partially successful, but they could not address the fundamental manpower shortages that had forced the empire to rely on foreign troops in the first place. The religious policies of Decius represented an even more ambitious attempt to restore traditional Roman values. The emperor was deeply troubled by the spread of Christianity and other foreign religions, which he saw as undermining the traditional beliefs that had made Rome great. In 250 CE, he issued an edict requiring all citizens to perform sacrifices to the traditional Roman gods, effectively launching the first empire-wide persecution of Christians. The Decian persecution was a systematic attempt to restore religious unity to the empire, but it proved to be both ineffective and counterproductive. Many Christians chose martyrdom rather than comply with the edict, creating a new generation of heroic figures who inspired further conversion. The persecution also diverted resources and attention from more pressing military and economic problems, while creating internal divisions that weakened the empire's ability to respond to external threats. The Gothic problem, meanwhile, continued to worsen despite Decius's military reforms. The barbarian invasions had evolved from simple raiding expeditions into a systematic campaign of conquest and settlement. The Goths, reinforced by other Germanic tribes and taking advantage of the empire's internal divisions, had established semi-permanent settlements in Roman territory and were proving increasingly difficult to dislodge. The climax of the Gothic Wars came in 251 CE with the Battle of Abritus, one of the most significant military disasters in Roman history. Decius, leading a large army in an attempt to drive the Goths from Roman territory once and for all, was outmaneuvered and defeated by the Gothic leader Niva. The battle was a tactical masterpiece by the barbarian commander, who used the terrain and his superior mobility to trap the Roman army in a marshy area where their heavy infantry could not maneuver effectively. The Battle of Abritus was remarkable not only for its tactical significance but also for its symbolic importance. For the first time in Roman history, a reigning emperor was killed in battle against barbarian forces. Decius died fighting at the head of his troops, along with his son Herennius Etruscus, who had been elevated to the rank of Caesar. The emperor's death was a profound shock to the Roman world and seemed to confirm the worst fears about the empire's decline. The aftermath of Abritus saw the Roman army in complete disarray. The defeat had been so comprehensive that organized resistance to the Goths temporarily collapsed, allowing the barbarians to ravage the Balkans almost at will. The psychological impact of the disaster was even greater than its immediate military consequences, as it demonstrated that Roman military supremacy was no longer automatic and that the empire's enemies were capable of achieving decisive victories. The succession crisis that followed Decius's death followed the now familiar pattern of military usurpation and civil war. Gaius Vibius Trebonianus Gallus, who had been serving as governor of Lower Moesia, was proclaimed emperor by the surviving remnants of the Roman army. His elevation was less a matter of choice than of desperate necessity, as the army needed a leader who could negotiate with the Goths and restore some measure of order to the chaotic situation. Trebonianus Gallus's reign was marked by a series of humiliating compromises that reflected the empire's desperate military situation. The new emperor was forced to negotiate a peace treaty with the Goths that allowed them to keep their conquests and granted them an annual subsidy in exchange for ending their raids. The treaty was a strategic disaster that essentially legitimized barbarian settlement in Roman territory, but it did provide temporary relief from the immediate crisis. The Gothic treaty was only the beginning of Trebonianus Gallus's problems. The empire was simultaneously facing a devastating plague that had spread from the east, economic collapse caused by currency debasement and disrupted trade, and renewed Persian aggression on the eastern frontier. The emperor's attempts to address these multiple crises were hampered by his lack of experience and the limited resources at his disposal. The plague, which modern scholars believe may have been smallpox or measles, had a devastating impact on the empire's already strained population. The disease spread rapidly through the densely populated cities and military camps, causing mortality rates that may have reached 30% in some areas. The demographic impact of the plague was compounded by the ongoing warfare and economic disruption, creating a downward spiral that would persist throughout the crisis period. The economic situation under Trebonianus Gallus reached new depths of desperation. The emperor was forced to continue the debasement of the currency in order to meet the government's obligations, but this only accelerated the inflationary spiral that was destroying the empire's monetary system. The silver content of the denarius, which had been gradually reduced over the previous decades, fell to less than 20% during his reign, effectively transforming the imperial currency into token money. The military situation continued to deteriorate as well. The Gothic treaty had ended one immediate threat, but it had also demonstrated Roman weakness and encouraged other barbarian groups to launch their own attacks. The Alemanni renewed their raids across the Rhine, while new enemies emerged in other frontier regions. The Roman army, weakened by plague and demoralized by repeated defeats, was increasingly unable to cope with these multiple challenges. The crisis came to a head in 253 CE when Marcus Aemilius Aemilianus, the governor of Upper Moesia, led a successful campaign against Gothic raiders who had violated the peace treaty. The victory, while relatively minor in strategic terms, was significant because it demonstrated that Roman arms could still achieve success against barbarian enemies. More importantly, it provided Aemilianus with the military prestige necessary to challenge Trebonianus Gallus for the imperial title. The confrontation between Trebonianus Gallus and Aemilianus followed the established pattern of civil war that had characterized the crisis period. Both men claimed legitimate authority, and both had military forces at their disposal. The outcome was decided by the relative loyalty and effectiveness of their respective armies, with Aemilianus's veterans proving superior to Trebonianus Gallus's demoralized troops. The Battle of Interamna in 253 CE saw the defeat and death of Trebonianus Gallus, along with his son Volusianus, who had been elevated to the rank of Augustus. The battle was relatively brief, as Trebonianus Gallus's forces were already weakened by plague and desertion. The emperor's death marked the end of another brief and unsuccessful reign, but it also demonstrated the continuing instability of the imperial system. Aemilianus's victory at Interamna made him the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, but his triumph was short-lived. The new emperor had barely consolidated his position when he faced a new challenge from Publius Licinius Valerianus, the governor of Rhaetia and Noricum, who had been approaching with an army ostensibly loyal to Trebonianus Gallus. Valerian, as he would become known, was a man of distinguished senatorial family who had served with distinction in various military and administrative posts. The confrontation between Aemilianus and Valerian never resulted in a decisive battle. Instead, Aemilianus was murdered by his own troops, who had decided that their prospects would be better under the new claimant. The emperor's death after only about 3 months of rule demonstrated the complete breakdown of military discipline and the extent to which the imperial system had descended into chaos. The brief reign of Aemilianus epitomized the problems that plagued the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. Military usurpation had become so common that successful generals were expected to claim the purple, regardless of their personal inclinations or qualifications for rule. The army had become kingmaker, but it was also the destroyer of kings, supporting and abandoning emperors based on immediate tactical considerations rather than long-term strategic thinking. The economic and social costs of this constant warfare were enormous. Each civil war disrupted trade, destroyed infrastructure, and diverted resources from productive activities to military expenditures. The psychological impact was equally severe, as the constant changes of government undermined confidence in the imperial system and encouraged local communities to seek their own solutions to the problems they faced. As 253 CE drew to a close, the Roman Empire stood at perhaps the lowest point in its history. The frontiers were collapsing under barbarian pressure, the economy was in ruins, and the government was characterized by chaos and violence. The death of Aemilianus marked the end of another chapter in the crisis, but it also opened the door to new challenges that would test the empire's capacity for survival even further. The accession of Valerian would bring new approaches to the empire's problems, but it would also lead to disasters that would make the previous failures seem minor by comparison. The worst was yet to come, and the empire would need to find new sources of strength and resilience if it was to survive the trials that lay ahead. The ascension of Publius Licinius Valerianus to the imperial throne in 253 CE marked the beginning of what would become one of the most extraordinary and tragic periods in Roman history. Valerian, as he is known to posterity, was a man of impeccable credentials who seemed to offer the empire exactly what it needed: experience, dignity, and the respect of both the army and the Senate. At approximately 60 years of age, he brought to the position a lifetime of distinguished service in both military and civilian capacities, having served as consul and held various provincial commands with distinction. Unlike many of his predecessors during the crisis, Valerian was not a military adventurer seeking personal glory, but rather a traditional Roman statesman who genuinely believed he could restore the empire to its former greatness. His approach to governance reflected the values of the old republic, emphasizing duty, honor, and service to the state. He understood that the empire's problems required more than military solutions and was prepared to implement comprehensive reforms that would address the underlying causes of the crisis. One of Valerian's most significant decisions was to elevate his son, Publius Licinius Ignatius Gallienus, to the rank of Augustus and co-emperor. This arrangement was designed to provide stability and continuity to the imperial succession, while also allowing the two rulers to divide the enormous burden of governing the empire. The choice of Gallienus as co-emperor was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating Valerian's confidence in his son's abilities while also ensuring that the Licinian dynasty would survive even if one of the emperors met an untimely end. The division of responsibilities between father and son reflected a realistic assessment of the empire's strategic situation. Valerian would take personal command of the eastern provinces, where the Persian threat remained the most immediate concern, while Gallienus would be responsible for the western territories, including Gaul, Spain, and Britain. This arrangement allowed each emperor to focus on specific regional challenges while maintaining overall coordination of imperial policy. Gallienus, who was in his late 30s at the time of his elevation, brought a different set of skills and perspectives to the imperial partnership. Unlike his father, who was steeped in traditional Roman values and practices, Gallienus was more cosmopolitan and intellectually curious. He had received an excellent education in both Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, and the arts, and he maintained friendships with many of the leading intellectuals of his day. This cultural sophistication would prove to be both an asset and a liability during his long and turbulent reign. The immediate challenges facing the new imperial partnership were daunting. The Gothic invasions continued to ravage the Balkans, with barbarian bands penetrating deep into Roman territory and establishing semi-permanent settlements. The economic crisis had reached catastrophic proportions, with inflation destroying the value of the currency and trade networks collapsing under the pressure of constant warfare. Perhaps most ominously, the Persian Empire under Shapur I was preparing for renewed aggression, having used the period of Roman civil war to consolidate their conquests and prepare for further expansion. The Persian situation required immediate attention, as intelligence reports indicated that Shapur I was assembling a massive army for a new invasion of Roman territory. The Persian king had been encouraged by his previous successes and was determined to exploit Roman weakness to achieve decisive territorial gains. The threat was so serious that Valerian decided to take personal command of the Eastern campaign, despite the risks involved in imperial participation in active warfare. The preparation for the Persian War required a massive mobilization of resources that demonstrated both the empire's remaining strength and its severe limitations. Troops were recalled from other frontiers, leaving those regions vulnerable to barbarian attack. The treasury was emptied to fund the campaign, requiring new taxes and continued currency debasement. The logistical challenges of moving and supplying a large army across the difficult terrain of the Near East were enormous, particularly given the disruption to trade routes and the general breakdown of administrative efficiency. The Persian campaign of 258 to 260 CE initially showed promise, with Roman forces achieving several tactical victories and recapturing some of the territories lost in previous conflicts. Valerian's personal leadership seemed to reinvigorate the Roman army, and his presence in the field demonstrated the imperial commitment to defending the eastern provinces. However, the campaign was hampered by the same problems that had plagued previous eastern expeditions: extended supply lines, hostile local populations, and the difficulty of maintaining large forces in the harsh climate of Mesopotamia. The situation deteriorated rapidly when a devastating plague broke out among the Roman troops. The disease, which may have been the same epidemic that had ravaged the empire during the previous decade, spread quickly through the crowded military camps and decimated the Roman army. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of horror as thousands of soldiers succumbed to the illness, leaving their comrades demoralized and the army's fighting capability severely compromised. The plague's impact extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The disease spread from the army to civilian populations throughout the eastern provinces, causing demographic catastrophe in cities and rural areas alike. The breakdown of trade and administration that accompanied the epidemic created conditions of famine and social disorder that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. The psychological impact was equally severe, as many Romans began to question whether the gods had abandoned the empire entirely. It was against this background of military failure and social collapse that the greatest disaster of Valerian's reign occurred. In 260 CE, while attempting to lift the siege of Edessa, the emperor was captured by Persian forces in circumstances that remain controversial. The exact details of Valerian's capture are disputed by the sources, with some accounts suggesting treachery and others indicating that the emperor was taken during a failed negotiation attempt. What is certain is that, for the first time in Roman history, a reigning emperor had been captured alive by a foreign enemy. The capture of Valerian was a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions that sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. The news of the emperor's fate was initially met with disbelief, as such a humiliation seemed impossible for a state that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. When the reality of the situation became clear, the psychological impact was devastating. The emperor was the living embodiment of Roman power and prestige, and his capture seemed to confirm the worst fears about the empire's decline. Shapur I made the most of his unprecedented victory, using Valerian's capture as a powerful propaganda tool to demonstrate Persian superiority over Rome. The Persian king forced the captive emperor to serve as a footstool when mounting his horse, a humiliation that was depicted in rock carvings and other monuments throughout the Persian Empire. Contemporary accounts describe how Valerian was displayed as a trophy at Persian court ceremonies, paraded before foreign ambassadors as evidence of Roman weakness. The fate of Valerian in captivity remains one of the most poignant tragedies of the crisis period. According to Persian sources, the emperor spent his remaining years as a prisoner in the Persian capital, subjected to daily humiliations designed to demonstrate his captor's superiority. When he finally died, probably around 264 CE, Shapur I ordered his body to be flayed and stuffed with straw, creating a macabre trophy that was displayed in a Persian temple. Whether these accounts are literally accurate or represent Persian propaganda, they illustrate the depths to which Roman prestige had fallen. The immediate consequence of Valerian's capture was a complete collapse of Roman resistance in the eastern provinces. The army, demoralized by the loss of their emperor and decimated by plague, was unable to continue the campaign. The surviving Roman forces withdrew in disorder, abandoning much of Mesopotamia and Syria to Persian occupation. The withdrawal was so precipitous that many Roman civilians were left to face Persian revenge without protection. The Persian victory at Edessa was followed by a systematic campaign of conquest that brought Shapur I's forces deep into Roman territory. The great city of Antioch, one of the empire's most important commercial and cultural centers, fell to the Persians after a brief siege. The capture of Antioch was particularly significant because it demonstrated that even the empire's greatest cities were vulnerable to barbarian attack. The psychological impact of the city's fall was comparable to the capture of Valerian himself. The Persian occupation of Roman territory was characterized by systematic destruction and exploitation. Cities were looted and burned, their populations enslaved or massacred. The sophisticated urban civilization that had flourished in the eastern provinces for centuries was systematically dismantled, with devastating consequences for the empire's economic and cultural life. The Persians were particularly interested in capturing skilled craftsmen and technical specialists, who were transported to the Persian Empire to contribute to its development. Meanwhile, in the western provinces, Gallienus faced challenges that were almost as severe as those confronting his father in the east. The Gothic invasions had resumed with renewed intensity, taking advantage of the troops withdrawn for the Persian campaign. The barbarian raids were now coordinated with attacks by other Germanic tribes, creating a multi-front crisis that stretched Roman defensive capabilities beyond their limits. The Alemanni, in particular, had launched a massive invasion of northern Italy, threatening Rome itself. The Italian invasion of 259 to 260 CE represented the most serious barbarian threat to the Roman heartland since the Gallic sack of the city in 390 BCE. The Alemanni, numbering perhaps 70,000 warriors, had crossed the Alps through undefended passes and were advancing rapidly toward Rome. The city's population, unaccustomed to the direct threat of barbarian attack, was seized by panic. Many wealthy citizens fled to the countryside, while others prepared to abandon the city entirely. Gallienus's response to the Italian crisis demonstrated both his military capabilities and his willingness to take personal risks for the empire's defense. Despite being heavily outnumbered and facing an army that had already proven its effectiveness against Roman forces, the emperor led a hastily assembled force to confront the invaders. The decisive battle was fought at Mediolanum, modern Milan, where Gallienus achieved a crucial victory that saved Italy from barbarian occupation. The victory at Mediolanum was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise disastrous period for the Roman Empire. Gallienus's personal leadership and tactical skill had achieved what seemed impossible, turning back a barbarian invasion that had threatened the very existence of the empire. The emperor's success demonstrated that Roman military prowess could still achieve decisive results when properly led and motivated. However, the victory in Italy could not disguise the empire's fundamental problems, which were becoming more severe with each passing year. The economic crisis had reached catastrophic proportions, with the currency effectively worthless and trade networks collapsing throughout the empire. The social fabric of Roman civilization was beginning to unravel, as traditional institutions proved inadequate to cope with the challenges of the crisis period. The most serious manifestation of the empire's disintegration was the emergence of separatist movements in the provinces. The capture of Valerian and the apparent inability of the central government to provide effective protection led many provincial communities to seek their own solutions to the problems they faced. The most significant of these movements was the revolt of Marcus Cassianius Latinius Postumus in Gaul, which would eventually lead to the creation of an independent Gallic empire. Postumus was a career soldier who had risen through the ranks to become governor of Lower Germany. His revolt began in 260 CE, shortly after news of Valerian's capture reached the western provinces. The immediate cause of the uprising was a dispute over the distribution of plunder from a successful campaign against barbarian raiders. But the underlying reasons were much more serious. The Gallic provinces had been devastated by repeated barbarian invasions, and the local population had lost confidence in the central government's ability to provide protection. The proclamation of Postumus as emperor was initially a local affair, supported primarily by the Rhine legions and the Gallic provincial elites. However, the movement quickly gained momentum as other provinces joined the rebellion. Britain, Spain, and eventually parts of Rhaetia and Noricum recognized Postumus's authority, creating a separate empire that controlled much of the western territories. The Gallic Empire, as it became known, represented the first successful breakaway from Roman central authority since the civil wars of the late Republic. The establishment of the Gallic Empire was a devastating blow to Gallienus's authority and to the unity of the Roman state. The loss of Gaul, Britain, and Spain deprived the central government of some of its most productive territories and reduced the empire's tax base by perhaps a third. More seriously, the success of the Gallic Revolt encouraged other separatist movements throughout the empire, threatening to complete the fragmentation of the Roman state. Postumus's success was based on his ability to provide what the central government had failed to deliver: effective defense against barbarian invasions. The Gallic Empire's military forces, drawn primarily from the experienced Rhine legions, proved remarkably effective at repelling Germanic attacks. The new state's smaller size and more focused objectives allowed it to concentrate its resources on frontier defense in a way that the broader empire could not match. The administrative structure of the Gallic Empire closely paralleled that of the Roman state, with Postumus adopting the full range of imperial titles and prerogatives. He established his capital at Cologne, created a senate and other governmental institutions, and began issuing coins that proclaimed his legitimacy. The new state's propaganda emphasized its role as the defender of Roman civilization against barbarian attack, implicitly criticizing the central government's failures. The economic policies of the Gallic Empire were particularly significant. Postumus implemented currency reforms that restored confidence in the monetary system, at least within his territories. The new state's coins contained substantially more silver than those issued by the central government, making them more acceptable to merchants and other commercial interests. The economic recovery that followed these reforms demonstrated the importance of sound financial management and highlighted the central government's failures in this area. The cultural and religious policies of the Gallic Empire also reflected its claims to represent true Roman values. Postumus and his successors patronized traditional Roman religion and culture, presenting themselves as the guardians of ancient customs that the central government had abandoned. This approach was particularly effective in winning the support of the provincial elites, who had been alienated by the chaos and corruption of the crisis period. The success of the Gallic Empire encouraged similar movements in other parts of the Roman world. The most significant of these was the emergence of Palmyra as an independent power in the eastern provinces. The city of Palmyra, located in the Syrian desert, had long served as a crucial link between the Roman Empire and the trade routes of the Far East. Its strategic position and commercial wealth had made it one of the most important cities in the eastern provinces. The rise of Palmyra as an independent power was largely the work of Septimius Odenathus, a member of the city's ruling elite who had maintained his loyalty to Rome during the Persian invasions. Odenathus had organized the defense of the eastern provinces after Valerian's capture, assembling a force of Palmyrene archers and Arab auxiliaries that proved surprisingly effective against Persian forces. His military successes had earned him recognition from Gallienus, who had granted him extensive authority over the eastern territories. The relationship between Palmyra and the central government was initially one of alliance rather than independence. Odenathus maintained the fiction of loyalty to Rome while effectively governing the eastern provinces as an autonomous ruler. This arrangement benefited both parties. Gallienus gained an effective ally in the east without having to commit substantial resources to the region, while Odenathus acquired the legitimacy and support necessary to maintain his position. The Palmyrene forces under Odenathus proved remarkably effective against the Persian Empire. The combination of desert warfare expertise and Roman military organization created a formidable fighting force that achieved several significant victories against Shapur I's armies. The most notable of these was the Battle of Ctesiphon in 263 CE, where Palmyrene forces successfully attacked the Persian capital and forced Shapur I to abandon his conquests in Roman territory. The assassination of Odenathus in 267 CE marked the beginning of a new phase in Palmyra's relationship with Rome. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, but the most likely explanation is that he was killed by members of his own family who were concerned about his growing independence from Roman authority. His death left a power vacuum in the eastern provinces that would be filled by one of the most remarkable figures of the 3rd century, his wife, Zenobia. Zenobia, who assumed power as regent for her young son Vabalithus, was a woman of extraordinary ability and ambition. Contemporary sources describe her as highly educated, fluent in several languages, and possessed of considerable military and political skill. She claimed descent from Cleopatra VII of Egypt and styled herself as the heir to the great Hellenistic queens of the past. Her court at Palmyra became a center of learning and culture that attracted scholars and artists from throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Under Zenobia's leadership, Palmyra gradually moved from alliance with Rome to open independence. The queen's forces, building on Odenathus's military successes, began to expand Palmyrene control throughout the eastern provinces. Egypt, with its crucial grain supplies, was occupied by Palmyrene forces, while much of Asia Minor fell under their influence. By 270 CE, Palmyra controlled territories that stretched from the Euphrates to the Nile, creating an eastern empire that rivaled Rome itself in size and importance. The emergence of Palmyra as an independent power represented the final stage in the fragmentation of the Roman Empire. By 270 CE, the Roman state had effectively split into 3 separate entities: the Central Empire under Gallienus, the Gallic Empire under Postumus and his successors, and the Palmyrene Empire under Zenobia. This tripartite division represented the nadir of Roman unity and seemed to confirm the worst fears about the empire's impending collapse. The plague that had contributed to Valerian's downfall continued to ravage the empire throughout the 260s, creating demographic catastrophe that compounded the political and military crises. The disease, which modern scholars believe may have been smallpox, spread rapidly through the interconnected urban centers of the Mediterranean world. The mortality rate was enormous, with some cities losing perhaps a third of their population. The social and economic consequences of this demographic collapse were severe and long-lasting. The plague's impact extended far beyond its immediate mortality. The death of skilled craftsmen, administrators, and soldiers created shortages that persisted long after the epidemic had passed. Agricultural production declined as rural populations were decimated, while urban centers experienced severe disruption to their commercial and administrative functions. The psychological impact was equally severe, as many Romans began to question whether the traditional gods had abandoned the empire entirely. The religious crisis that accompanied the plague manifested itself in various ways. Traditional Roman religion, which had provided comfort and meaning for centuries, seemed inadequate to explain or address the catastrophes that were befalling the empire. Christianity, which had been growing steadily despite periodic persecutions, gained new converts who were attracted by its promise of salvation and its emphasis on caring for the sick and dying. Other mystery religions and philosophical movements also gained adherents as people sought new sources of meaning and hope. The economic consequences of the plague were compounded by the continued debasement of the currency and the disruption of trade networks. The silver content of Roman coins fell to less than 5% during the 260s, effectively transforming the imperial currency into worthless tokens. Inflation reached catastrophic levels, with prices for basic commodities rising by factors of hundreds or even thousands. The monetary system that had facilitated trade throughout the Mediterranean world for centuries was collapsing. The breakdown of the monetary system forced many regions to return to barter or to develop local currencies that could serve immediate commercial needs. This economic fragmentation paralleled the political division of the empire and contributed to the decentralization of power that characterized the crisis period. Local communities were forced to become more self-sufficient, leading to a gradual breakdown of the integrated economic system that had been one of Rome's greatest achievements. Gallienus's response to these multiple crises demonstrated both his capabilities and his limitations as a ruler. The emperor proved to be an able military commander who could achieve tactical victories against barbarian invaders, but he lacked the resources and institutional support necessary to address the empire's fundamental problems. His attempts at administrative reform were hampered by the constant need to respond to military crises, while his efforts to restore economic stability were undermined by the costs of continuous warfare. The military reforms implemented by Gallienus were particularly significant for the future development of the Roman army. Recognizing that the traditional legionary system was inadequate for dealing with the mobile barbarian warfare that characterized the crisis period, he began to develop new types of military units that emphasized speed and flexibility. The creation of mobile cavalry forces and the increased use of Germanic auxiliaries represented a fundamental shift in Roman military organization that would influence imperial strategy for centuries to come. The exclusion of senators from military commands, implemented by Gallienus around 262 CE, represented another significant change in imperial administration. This reform, motivated by the need to prevent senatorial usurpations, had the effect of creating a more professional officer corps while further marginalizing the traditional Roman aristocracy. The change reflected the militarization of imperial government that had been proceeding throughout the crisis period. Despite these reforms, Gallienus remained unable to address the empire's fundamental problems. The loss of the Gallic provinces and the emergence of Palmyra as an independent power had reduced the central government's resources to the point where effective action was nearly impossible. The emperor's attempts to reconquer the lost territories were hampered by the need to defend Italy and the Balkans against continued barbarian invasions. The Gothic invasions of the 260s represented a new phase in the barbarian threat to the Roman Empire. The Goths, reinforced by other Germanic tribes and taking advantage of the empire's internal divisions, launched a series of coordinated attacks that penetrated deep into Roman territory. The most serious of these was the Great Gothic Raid of 267 to 268 CE, which saw barbarian forces reach as far south as Athens and Sparta. The Gothic invasion of Greece was a cultural catastrophe that shocked the Roman world. The barbarians systematically destroyed many of the greatest monuments of classical civilization, including the destruction of the famous Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and the sack of numerous other cultural centers. The psychological impact of these attacks was enormous, as they seemed to confirm that the barbarians were not content merely to raid Roman territory, but were intent on destroying Roman civilization itself. Gallienus's response to the Gothic invasion demonstrated both his military skill and his commitment to defending the empire's cultural heritage. The emperor personally led a campaign against the invaders, achieving a crucial victory at the Battle of Nisus in 268 CE. The victory was one of the most significant Roman military achievements of the crisis period, effectively ending the Gothic threat to the southern provinces and demonstrating that barbarian forces could still be defeated by competent Roman leadership. However, the victory at Nisus came at a terrible cost. The constant warfare had exhausted the empire's remaining resources and had created conditions of near anarchy in many provinces. The army, while still capable of achieving tactical victories, was increasingly unreliable and prone to mutiny. The emperor's own position was becoming precarious, as military commanders throughout the empire began to question his authority and his ability to restore order. The assassination of Gallienus in 268 CE, near the city of Mediolanum, marked the end of the longest and most eventful reign of the crisis period. The emperor's death was the result of a military conspiracy led by his own officers, who had grown frustrated with his inability to solve the empire's problems. The assassination followed the familiar pattern of military usurpation that had characterized the crisis, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the empire's recovery. The death of Gallienus brought to an end the era of the fragmented empire and opened the way for the military emperors who would eventually restore Roman unity. The emperor's reign, while marked by numerous disasters and failures, had also seen important innovations in military organization and administration that would prove crucial for the empire's eventual recovery. His exclusion of senators from military commands and his development of mobile cavalry forces would be continued by his successors and would form the basis for the reformed imperial army of the later 3rd century. The legacy of the Valerian Gallienus period was thus paradoxical. It represented the nadir of Roman power and unity, with the empire fragmented into 3 separate entities and facing apparently insurmountable challenges. Yet it also saw important innovations and adaptations that would prove crucial for the empire's survival. The crisis had reached its deepest point, but the foundations for recovery were already being laid. The assassination of Gallienus in 268 CE marked a turning point in the crisis of the 3rd century, though few contemporaries could have realized it at the time. The conspiracy that brought about his death was led by Marcus Aurelius Claudius, a professional soldier from the Danubian provinces who had served with distinction in the campaigns against the Goths. Known to history as Claudius II Gothicus, he would prove to be the first in a series of military emperors who would gradually restore the empire's strength and unity. Claudius was a man of humble origins who embodied the values of the frontier army that had become the backbone of Roman military power. Born in the province of Moesia, he had spent his entire adult life in military service, rising through the ranks through competence and courage rather than birth or political connections. His appearance was unremarkable. Contemporary sources describe him as a man of medium height with graying hair and weathered features that reflected decades of campaigning, but his presence commanded respect from soldiers who had grown cynical about imperial authority. The new emperor's first challenge was to establish his legitimacy with an army that had grown accustomed to making and unmaking emperors at will. Claudius understood that his authority would depend entirely on his ability to deliver military success, and he moved quickly to demonstrate his competence as a commander. The Gothic threat, which had been temporarily contained by Gallienus's victory at Nisus, was beginning to reassert itself as new barbarian confederations prepared to test the resolve of the new regime. The Gothic invasions of 269 CE represented perhaps the most serious barbarian threat the empire had faced since the Great Raid of 267 to 268 CE. The barbarian forces, estimated at over 100,000 warriors, had assembled in the regions north of the Danube and were preparing for a coordinated assault on the Roman provinces. The Goths had learned from their previous experiences with Roman forces and had developed new tactics that emphasized their traditional mobility while incorporating lessons learned from captured Roman equipment and deserters. The barbarian confederation that assembled for the invasion of 269 CE was more diverse and sophisticated than any previous Gothic force. In addition to the traditional Gothic tribes, the invading army included contingents of Heruli, Gepids, and other Germanic peoples, as well as Sarmatian cavalry and even some Dacian units that had maintained their independence north of the Danube. This diverse coalition was held together by the promise of Roman plunder and the leadership of experienced war chiefs who had fought against the empire for decades. The Gothic strategy for the invasion was both ambitious and well-planned. The main force would cross the Danube in the traditional manner, seeking to overwhelm Roman frontier defenses through sheer numbers and ferocity. Simultaneously, a substantial naval force would sail through the Black Sea and around the coast of Asia Minor, attacking the wealthy cities of the eastern provinces while the main Roman armies were engaged in the north. This coordinated land and sea assault was designed to stretch Roman defenses beyond their breaking point. Claudius's response to the Gothic threat demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his brief but significant reign. Rather than attempting to defend the entire frontier simultaneously, he concentrated his forces at key strategic points while using mobile reserves to respond to barbarian breakthroughs. The emperor understood that the empire's reduced resources made it impossible to maintain the static defense lines that had characterized previous centuries, and he was prepared to adopt more flexible tactics that traded space for time. The decisive campaign began in the spring of 269 CE, when the main Gothic force crossed the Danube and began advancing into Roman territory. The barbarians initially achieved considerable success, overwhelming several frontier posts and advancing deep into the province of Moesia. However, their progress was slowed by the need to besiege fortified cities and by the systematic destruction of supplies and infrastructure by Roman forces retreating in front of them. The climax of the campaign came at the Battle of Nisus, fought on the same ground where Gallienus had achieved his great victory the previous year. The engagement was one of the largest battles of the 3rd century, with Roman forces numbering perhaps 50,000 men facing a Gothic army that may have been twice that size. The battle was characterized by desperate fighting that lasted throughout an entire day, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage until late in the afternoon. The turning point came when Claudius personally led a cavalry charge against the Gothic center, breaking through their lines and creating panic in the barbarian ranks. The emperor's personal courage and tactical skill were crucial to the Roman victory, but equally important was the superior discipline and training of the Roman troops. The Gothic army, despite its numerical superiority, was composed largely of tribal warriors who lacked the coordination and staying power of professional soldiers. The aftermath of the battle was catastrophic for the Gothic Confederation. The barbarian army, which had seemed invincible during its initial advance, disintegrated under the pressure of pursuit by Roman cavalry. Thousands of Gothic warriors were killed or captured, while the survivors fled back across the Danube in complete disorder. The victory was so complete that it effectively ended the Gothic threat to the Danube provinces for a generation. The naval component of the Gothic invasion met with similar disaster. The barbarian fleet, which had successfully raided several cities along the coast of Asia Minor, was intercepted by Roman naval forces near the island of Lemnos. The sea battle that followed was a complete victory for the Romans, with most of the Gothic ships being sunk or captured. The few barbarian vessels that escaped were harried by Roman forces as they attempted to return to their bases in the Black Sea. The double victory over the Goths by land and sea transformed Claudius from a usurper into a legitimate emperor in the eyes of both the army and the Roman people. The cognomen Gothicus was added to his name in recognition of his achievements, and he was hailed as the savior of the empire. The victories also demonstrated that Roman military power, when properly led and organized, could still achieve decisive results against barbarian enemies. However, the emperor's triumph was short-lived. In 270 CE, while preparing for a campaign against the Alemanni, Claudius was struck down by the plague that continued to ravage the empire. The disease, which may have been the same epidemic that had contributed to Valerian's downfall a decade earlier, spread rapidly through the army and claimed the emperor as one of its victims. His death was mourned throughout the empire as a catastrophic loss at a time when competent leadership was desperately needed. The brief reign of Claudius II, lasting only about 2 years, had nevertheless achieved results that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Gothic threat had been eliminated, the army had been restored to effectiveness, and the empire had been given a breathing space that would prove crucial for its eventual recovery. The emperor's death was a reminder of the fragility of human achievements, but his legacy would inspire his successors to continue the work of restoration. The succession crisis that followed Claudius's death was resolved with unusual speed and efficiency. Marcus Aurelius Claudius Quintillus, the emperor's brother, was proclaimed emperor by the Senate, but his reign lasted only a few months before he was overthrown by Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, a cavalry commander who had served with distinction under Claudius. The transfer of power, while violent, was accomplished without the prolonged civil war that had characterized previous imperial transitions. Aurelian, as he is known to history, was perhaps the most remarkable of the military emperors who restored the Roman Empire during the later 3rd century. Born into a humble family in the Danubian provinces, he had risen through the ranks of the army through exceptional courage and military skill. Contemporary sources describe him as a man of imposing physical presence, with the bearing of a natural leader and the ruthless determination necessary for the challenges he would face. The new emperor's cognomen, Restitutor Orbis, or Restorer of the World, would prove to be well-deserved. Aurelian's reign, though lasting only 5 years, would see the reunification of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the recovery that would eventually lead to the reforms of Diocletian. His achievements were all the more remarkable because they were accomplished in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The situation that confronted Aurelian upon his accession was dire. The empire remained fragmented into 3 separate entities, with the Gallic Empire continuing to control the western provinces and Palmyra dominating the east. The central government's resources were stretched to the breaking point, and barbarian invasions continued to threaten the frontiers. The economic crisis remained severe, with inflation continuing to erode the value of the currency and trade networks still disrupted by warfare and insecurity. Aurelian's strategy for addressing these challenges was characterized by a combination of military aggression and diplomatic skill. He understood that the empire's fragmentation was both a symptom and a cause of its weakness, and he was determined to restore unity even if it meant years of continuous warfare. His approach was methodical and systematic, focusing on one problem at a time while maintaining defensive positions elsewhere. The emperor's first major campaign was directed against the Alemanni, who had resumed their raids into northern Italy despite their previous defeats. The barbarian threat was serious enough that Aurelian felt compelled to construct new walls around Rome itself, the first time in centuries that the capital had required fortification. The construction of the Aurelian walls, as they came to be known, was a massive undertaking that employed thousands of workers and consumed enormous resources. The Aurelian walls represented both a practical response to the barbarian threat and a powerful symbol of the empire's reduced circumstances. The fact that Rome itself required fortification was a stark reminder of how far the empire had fallen from its former glory. However, the walls also demonstrated the government's determination to defend the city and the empire's continuing capacity for large-scale construction projects. The barbarian campaign of 271 CE was a complete success, with Aurelian achieving a decisive victory over the Alemanni at the Battle of Fano. The emperor's tactical skill and personal courage were crucial to the Roman victory, but equally important was the improved morale and organization of the Roman army. The troops, inspired by their commander's example and motivated by the prospect of defending Italy itself, fought with a determination that had been lacking in previous campaigns. The victory over the Alemanni was followed by successful campaigns against other barbarian groups that had taken advantage of the empire's weakness. The Juthungi, Marcomanni, and other Germanic tribes were defeated in a series of engagements that restored Roman control over the Alpine passes and northern Italy. These victories demonstrated that the empire's military recovery was genuine and sustainable, not merely the result of temporary advantages. With the barbarian threat temporarily contained, Aurelian turned his attention to the more complex challenge of reunifying the empire. The Gallic Empire, under the leadership of Gaius Pius Esuvius Tetricus, continued to control Britain, Gaul, and parts of Spain. The Palmyrene Empire, now ruled by Zenobia in the name of her son Vabalithus, dominated the eastern provinces from Egypt to Asia Minor. Both breakaway states remained militarily formidable and enjoyed significant popular support in their respective regions. The emperor's strategy for reunification was based on a careful assessment of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two separatist regimes. The Gallic Empire, while militarily competent, was facing increasing pressure from barbarian invasions and internal dissension. The Palmyrene Empire, though wealthy and well-organized, was geographically isolated and dependent on precarious supply lines. Aurelian decided to deal with Palmyra first, both because it posed the more immediate threat and because its defeat would provide resources for the subsequent campaign against the Gallic Empire. The Eastern Campaign of 272 CE was one of the most remarkable military achievements of the 3rd century. Aurelian's army, composed primarily of troops from the Danubian provinces, marched across Asia Minor and into Syria with a speed and efficiency that caught the Palmyrenes completely off guard. The emperor's logistical planning was exceptional, with supply lines carefully organized and alternative routes prepared in case of enemy interference. The confrontation with Zenobia and her forces demonstrated the complex cultural and political dynamics of the 3rd century empire. The Palmyrene queen was a formidable opponent who had successfully maintained her independence for several years, but she was also a Roman citizen who had originally claimed to be acting in the empire's interests. The conflict was thus both a civil war and a war of imperial unification, with both sides claiming to represent legitimate Roman authority. The decisive battle of the Eastern Campaign was fought at Imi, near Antioch, where Aurelian's forces confronted the main Palmyrene army. The engagement was notable for the tactical innovations employed by both sides, with the Palmyrenes using heavy cavalry and horse archers in the Persian style, while the Romans relied on their traditional infantry formations supplemented by mobile cavalry units developed during the crisis period. The Battle of Imi was a tactical victory for Aurelian, but it was not decisive. The Palmyrene army, though defeated, was not destroyed, and Zenobia was able to withdraw her forces in good order. The queen's strategic retreat demonstrated her military competence and her understanding that the war would be decided by endurance rather than single battles. The campaign would require additional victories before the Eastern Empire could be considered conquered. The siege of Palmyra itself was the culmination of Aurelian's Eastern campaign. The city, located in the Syrian desert, was naturally defensible and had been strengthened with additional fortifications. The siege required careful planning and exceptional logistical support, as the Roman army had to be supplied across hundreds of miles of desert terrain. The operation demonstrated the organizational capabilities that had been developed during the crisis period and showed that the Roman military machine could still undertake complex operations. The capture of Palmyra in 272 CE marked the end of the Eastern Empire and the beginning of the reunification of the Roman world. Zenobia was taken prisoner and later displayed in Aurelian's triumph in Rome, though she was reportedly treated with dignity and allowed to live in comfortable retirement. The fall of Palmyra was celebrated throughout the empire as a sign that Roman power was being restored and that the crisis was finally coming to an end. The destruction of Palmyra as a political and commercial center was both a military necessity and a symbolic statement about the consequences of defying Roman authority. The city's walls were demolished, its palaces destroyed, and its population dispersed. The elimination of Palmyra as a rival power center ensured that the eastern provinces would remain under central control, but it also marked the end of one of the most remarkable cultural and commercial centers of the ancient world. The conquest of the East provided Aurelian with the resources and confidence necessary to address the challenge of the Gallic Empire. The wealth of the eastern provinces, combined with the prestige of victory over Zenobia, gave the emperor significant advantages in the coming campaign. However, the Gallic Empire remained a formidable opponent with experienced military forces and strong popular support in its territories. The Gallic campaign of 274 CE was conducted with the same systematic approach that had characterized Aurelian's eastern operations. The emperor's forces advanced methodically through the Alpine passes and into Gaul, avoiding premature confrontation while establishing secure supply lines and communication networks. The campaign demonstrated the lessons learned from decades of military experience and showed that the Roman army had evolved to meet the challenges of the crisis period. The decisive confrontation with Tetricus and the Gallic forces came at the Battle of Chalons, where Aurelian achieved a complete victory that effectively ended the independence of the Gallic Empire. The battle was notable for the relatively light casualties on both sides, partly due to Tetricus's apparent collusion with Aurelian and partly due to the war-weariness of the Gallic forces. The reunification of the western provinces was accomplished with less bloodshed than might have been expected. The surrender of Tetricus was handled with the diplomatic skill that characterized Aurelian's approach to the reunification process. The former emperor was pardoned and given a position in the imperial administration, demonstrating that reconciliation was possible for those who submitted to Roman authority. This policy of clemency was crucial for maintaining stability in the newly recovered territories and preventing further rebellions. The reunification of the Roman Empire under Aurelian was completed in 274 CE, marking the end of the most dangerous phase of the 3rd century crisis. The empire was once again united under a single ruler, the major barbarian threats had been contained, and the economy was showing signs of recovery. However, the emperor's achievements were overshadowed by the continuing challenges of governing a state that had been fundamentally changed by the crisis. The administrative reforms implemented by Aurelian reflected his understanding that the empire's problems went beyond military challenges. The currency was reformed and restabilized, with new coins issued that contained more silver and were more acceptable to merchants and traders. The taxation system was reorganized to provide more predictable revenue streams, while efforts were made to restore trade networks and commercial confidence. The religious policies of Aurelian were particularly significant for the empire's future development. The emperor was a devotee of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and he attempted to promote this deity as a unifying force that could bind together the empire's diverse populations. The construction of a great temple to Sol Invictus in Rome was intended to provide a religious focus for imperial unity while appealing to the solar cults that had become popular throughout the empire. The military reforms of Aurelian built upon the innovations of his predecessors while addressing the specific challenges revealed by the crisis. The army was reorganized to emphasize mobility and flexibility, with increased reliance on cavalry and other specialist units. The traditional legionary system was retained but modified to meet the requirements of defending extended frontiers against mobile barbarian forces. The economic recovery that began under Aurelian was facilitated by the restoration of security and the reunification of the empire's commercial networks. Trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare and political fragmentation were reopened, while the standardization of currency and commercial practices reduced transaction costs and encouraged investment. The recovery was gradual and incomplete, but it marked the beginning of the empire's emergence from the crisis. The cultural renaissance that accompanied the political and military recovery was equally significant. The reunification of the empire allowed for renewed cultural exchange and artistic development, while the restoration of security encouraged the construction of new public buildings and the restoration of others that had been damaged during the crisis. The period saw a revival of interest in classical literature and philosophy, as well as the development of new artistic styles that reflected the empire's changed circumstances. However, Aurelian's remarkable achievements were cut short by his assassination in 275 CE, near the city of Byzantium. The emperor's death was the result of a conspiracy among his own officers, who had been misled by forged documents into believing that they were about to be executed. The assassination was a tragic reminder of the continuing instability of the imperial system and the fragility of personal rule during the crisis period. The death of Aurelian created a brief interregnum that demonstrated both the progress made toward stability and the continuing challenges facing the empire. The Senate, asserting its traditional prerogatives, nominated Marcus Claudius Tacitus, an elderly senator, as emperor. Tacitus was a man of impeccable credentials who represented the traditional values of the Roman aristocracy, but his advanced age and lack of military experience made him an unlikely choice for the demanding conditions of the 3rd century. The reign of Tacitus lasted only about 6 months, but it was significant for demonstrating the continuing vitality of Roman institutions and the possibility of peaceful succession. The emperor's death from natural causes in 276 CE was followed by the brief reign of his brother Florian, who was quickly overthrown by Marcus Aurelius Probus, another professional soldier from the Danubian provinces. Probus represented the continuation of the military tradition that had produced Claudius II and Aurelian, and his reign would see further consolidation of the gains made during the previous decade. The new emperor's cognomen, which means upright or honest, reflected his reputation for integrity and competence, qualities that were essential for maintaining the loyalty of the army and the confidence of the civilian population. The challenges facing Probus were similar to those that had confronted his predecessors, but they were complicated by the need to maintain the gains that had been achieved while addressing new threats and problems. The barbarian menace, while temporarily contained, remained a constant concern that required vigilance and resources. The economic recovery, while promising, was still fragile and vulnerable to disruption. Most importantly, the imperial system itself remained unstable, with the potential for new usurpations and civil wars always present. The military campaigns of Probus focused primarily on consolidating the frontiers and eliminating remaining barbarian threats. The emperor achieved significant victories against the Alemanni, Franks, and other Germanic tribes, while also conducting successful operations against rebels and bandits in various parts of the empire. These campaigns demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of the reformed Roman army and the empire's capacity for military action. The economic policies of Probus built upon the foundations laid by Aurelian while addressing specific problems that had emerged during the recovery period. The emperor promoted agricultural development, particularly in the provinces, and encouraged the expansion of viticulture and other commercial activities. These policies reflected an understanding that the empire's long-term prosperity depended on productive economic activity rather than military conquest. The cultural achievements of Probus's reign were less spectacular than those of his predecessors, but they were nonetheless significant for the empire's development. The emperor patronized learning and the arts, while also supporting the construction of public buildings and infrastructure projects. The period saw a continued revival of classical culture and the development of new artistic and literary forms that reflected the empire's changed circumstances. The death of Probus in 282 CE, killed by mutinous soldiers near the city of Sirmium, marked the end of the series of military emperors who had restored the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. The emperor's assassination was a reminder that the fundamental problems of the imperial system had not been solved, despite the remarkable achievements of the previous decades. The legacy of the soldier emperors who ruled from Claudius II to Probus was profound and lasting. They had rescued the empire from the brink of collapse, restored its unity and military effectiveness, and laid the foundations for the comprehensive reforms that would be implemented by Diocletian. Their achievements demonstrated the resilience of Roman civilization and the empire's capacity for adaptation and recovery, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. As the 3rd century drew to a close, the Roman Empire stood transformed by the crisis it had endured. The empire that emerged from the catastrophes of the mid-3rd century was different from the one that had existed before, but it was also stronger and more adaptable. The lessons learned during the crisis would inform the reforms of the following century and help ensure the empire's survival for another 1,000 years in the east and several centuries more in the west. The assassination of Probus in 282 CE marked the end of an era, but it also opened the door to the most significant transformation in Roman government since the establishment of the Principate by Augustus nearly 3 centuries earlier. The man who would emerge from the chaos following Probus's death was Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, known to history as Diocletian, whose reforms would not only end the crisis of the 3rd century but would fundamentally reshape the Roman Empire for centuries to come. Diocletian's path to power followed the familiar pattern of military usurpation that had characterized the crisis period, but his subsequent actions would prove that he was far more than just another soldier emperor. Born in the province of Dalmatia around 244 CE, he had risen through the ranks of the army during the turbulent decades of the mid-3rd century, serving with distinction under various emperors and gaining the respect of his fellow soldiers through competence and integrity rather than spectacular achievements. The immediate aftermath of Probus's assassination saw the proclamation of Marcus Aurelius Carus as emperor, followed by the brief reigns of his sons Carinus and Numerian. The period was marked by the familiar pattern of civil war and military usurpation, but it was also characterized by a growing sense that the empire needed more than just another military strongman. The army itself was becoming weary of constant warfare and instability, and there was a growing desire for a ruler who could provide lasting solutions to the empire's problems. The decisive moment came in 284 CE, when Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by the army following the mysterious death of Numerian during a campaign against the Persians. The circumstances of his elevation were not particularly auspicious. He was yet another military commander claiming power through force, but his actions over the following months would demonstrate that he possessed the vision and administrative skill necessary to address the empire's fundamental challenges. Diocletian's first priority was to establish his authority over the entire empire, which required defeating Carinus, who still controlled the western provinces. The civil war that followed was brief but decisive, with Diocletian achieving victory at the Battle of the Margus in 285 CE. However, rather than simply celebrating his military triumph, the new emperor immediately began implementing the systematic reforms that would transform the Roman state. The most revolutionary of Diocletian's innovations was the creation of the Tetrarchy, a system of government that divided the empire among 4 rulers. The system was designed to address the fundamental problem that had plagued the empire throughout the crisis: the impossibility of governing such a vast territory effectively from a single center. Under the Tetrarchic system, 2 senior emperors, known as Augusti, would be assisted by 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars, with each ruler responsible for a specific geographic region. The Tetrarchy represented a profound departure from the traditional Roman concept of imperial rule. For centuries, The empire had been governed by a single emperor who embodied the unity and authority of the Roman state. Diocletian's innovation acknowledged that this system was no longer viable given the empire's size and the complexity of its problems. The Tetrarchy was both a practical solution to administrative challenges and a philosophical statement about the nature of imperial power. The implementation of the Tetrarchic system was gradual and careful, reflecting Diocletian's understanding that such a radical change required delicate handling. In 286 CE, he elevated Maximian to the rank of Augustus, making him co-emperor with responsibility for the western provinces. This arrangement initially resembled the joint rule that had been attempted by Valerian and Gallienus, but Diocletian's approach was more systematic and comprehensive. The selection of Maximian as Western Augustus demonstrated Diocletian's political acumen and his understanding of the qualities necessary for effective imperial leadership. Maximian was a career soldier from the Danubian provinces who had served with distinction in various campaigns, but more importantly, he was a man whose loyalty to Diocletian was unquestioned. The partnership between the two emperors was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to the empire's restoration. The addition of the two Caesars in 293 CE completed the Tetrarchic system. Constantius Chlorus was appointed as Caesar in the west, while Galerius became Caesar in the east. Both men were experienced military commanders who had proven their competence in previous campaigns, but they were also chosen for their loyalty to the Tetrarchic system and their willingness to accept subordinate roles within the imperial hierarchy. The geographic division of the empire under the Tetrarchy was based on practical considerations of defense and administration. Diocletian retained direct control over the eastern provinces, including Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, while Maximian governed Italy, Africa, and the western Mediterranean. Constantius was responsible for Gaul, Britain, and Spain, while Galerius controlled the Danubian provinces and the Balkans. This division allowed each ruler to focus on the specific challenges of his region, while maintaining overall coordination of imperial policy. The Tetrarchic system was more than just a division of territory. It was a complete reorganization of imperial administration. Each of the four rulers maintained his own court, complete with administrative staff, military commanders, and ceremonial apparatus. This multiplication of imperial institutions was expensive, but it also provided redundancy and flexibility that had been lacking under the previous system of single rule. The military reforms implemented under the Tetrarchy were equally comprehensive and far-reaching. Diocletian and his colleagues recognized that the army needed to be completely reorganized to meet the challenges of the 4th century. The traditional legionary system, which had served the empire well for centuries, was modified to emphasize mobility and flexibility while maintaining the discipline and training that had always been the hallmarks of Roman military power. The new military organization distinguished between frontier armies, known as limitanii, and mobile field armies, known as comitatenses. The limitanii were stationed permanently along the frontiers and were responsible for the first line of defense against barbarian incursions. These units were smaller and more specialized than the traditional legions, but they were also more numerous and better integrated into the local communities they defended. The comitatenses represented a more revolutionary innovation. These mobile field armies were kept in reserve behind the frontier defenses and could be rapidly deployed to respond to major threats. The concept of strategic reserves was not entirely new, but the systematic organization of mobile forces represented a significant departure from previous military practice. The comitatenses were better equipped and trained than the limitanii, and they formed the backbone of the empire's offensive capabilities. The expansion of the army under the Tetrarchy was enormous, with the total number of troops possibly doubling from the levels of the early 3rd century.